Deep in the Ozark Mountains, a remote region of Missouri, there is a story that few know and even fewer dare to tell. Within deep valleys and beneath dense forests that blocked the sun, families lived in isolation for generations, creating a world of their own with its own rules. It was in 1978 that the rural doctor Dr. Robert Liston first documented the case of the Whitaker sisters. Eleanor, Margaret, and Ruth, born between 1932 and 1937, were the daughters of first-degree cousins, who in turn descended from a family line with centuries of marriages between relatives. When I first visited that property, I noticed something peculiar, wrote Dr. Liston in his medical diary, now preserved at the University of Missouri. The curtains remained closed even during the day. I was received by the older brother, Thomas, the only one apparently without visible deformities. If you have not subscribed the channel, kindly subscribe our channel and press the bell icon for such latest videos. What the doctor discovered inside that isolated house would disturb him for the rest of his career. The three sisters had severe facial deformities, misaligned jaws, asymmetrical eyes, cranial malformations, and extreme dental problems. Even more striking, they all wore handmade cloth masks, even inside the home, even in the presence of their own family. Eleanor, the oldest, was the one who first removed her mask so I could examine her, said Liston. The reflection of pain in her eyes when she realized my initial reaction remains with me to this day. Medical analyses revealed that the Whitaker sisters suffered from mandibulofacial dysostosis, a rare genetic condition usually associated with Treacher-Collins syndrome, but with manifestations particularly severe due to successive consanguineous marriages. Parish records and local censuses surveyed later confirmed at least 7 generations of weddings among cousins in the family. The outside world remained ignorant of the sisters' existence until 1983, when a brief mention in a regional medical newspaper caught the scientific community's attention. However, the family consistently refused any public exposure, protecting the sisters from social scrutiny. The story of the Whitaker sisters is not an isolated case. On the contrary, it represents a broader phenomenon in the isolated rural communities of America, where geographical, cultural, and religious isolation created conditions for consanguineous marriage practices that persisted long after they were widely abandoned elsewhere. If you have not subscribed the channel, kindly subscribe our channel and press the bell icon for such latest videos. Cases like the Whitaker sisters are rarely documented with this depth, and our research brings to light stories that society prefers to forget. To fully understand the drama of women who hid their faces behind masks, we need to understand the science behind their conditions. Dr. James Warren, a geneticist at the University of Columbia who studied similar cases in 1992, explains, consanguinity itself does not create new genetic mutations. What it does is increase the chance that harmful recessive genes, which would usually remain dormant for generations, manifest when the same genetic variant is inherited from both parents. In the specific case of the Whitaker sisters, later genetic analyses revealed an extraordinary concentration of deleterious recessive alleles, a perfect genetic storm that resulted in the severe deformities that afflicted them. The medical records of Shannon County, Missouri, preserved in the State Historic Archive, show that between 1920 and 1970, the incidence of congenital defects in this region was 47% higher than the national average. A 1965 public health report, which remained classified for decades due to concerns about stigmatizing the community, documented clusters of congenital malformations in specific families. The communities of the Ozark Mountains developed a triple isolation, explains anthropologist Dr. Sarah McKenzie, who has studied the region for 2 decades. First, geographic insulation with precarious roads and rugged terrain. Second, cultural isolation with a deep distrust of outsiders. Third, genetic isolation with a limited group of potential partners. This isolation was not accidental. Historical records show that many of these families deliberately fled the scrutiny of wider society. The Whitakers, for example, were descendants of settlers who settled in the region in the 1830s, deliberately choosing remote lands to avoid religious persecution. The community developed marriage practices that favored unions within the same family circle, often justified by particular religious interpretations and the need to keep the land within the family. Local church documents dated 1875 show a local pastor defending marriages between cousins as blessed by the Lord to maintain the purity of the lineage. If you have not subscribed the channel, kindly subscribe our channel and press the bell icon for such latest videos. In 1952, when Eleanor Whitaker was 20 years old, an itinerant doctor offered surgical treatment to alleviate her deformities. The family refused. According to Dr. Liston's report, they saw the condition of the girls not as a disease but as a divine trial that should be borne with dignity. The masks emerged as a practical solution. Initially made by the girl's mother and later by themselves, the masks were carefully sewn from dark fabrics, covering most of the face with openings only for the eyes. Rare photographs preserved in Dr. Liston's medical archive show that the masks were surprisingly elaborate, with embroidered details that suggested an idealized face. The paradoxical tragedy is that the same isolation that contributed to their condition also protected them from the cruel social scrutiny they would certainly have faced in the outside world. In the few interviews given to Dr. Liston between 1978 and 1985, gathered in his confidential medical archive and partially released for research in 2010, the Whitaker sisters revealed fragments of their extraordinary lives. Margaret, the middle sister, described her daily routine: "We woke up before dawn to do the outdoor tasks. It is better to work when it is dark." The three sisters developed a meticulous system to minimize their exposure. They cultivated a garden at the back of the property, surrounded by tall trees, and raised chickens and goats, animals that, according to them, did not care about appearances. Their brother Thomas handled all interactions with the outside world, shopping in the city, negotiations, and bank affairs. "Eleanor was the best seamstress I've ever met," said an elderly neighbor in 1992, who had occasionally exchanged eggs for embroidery with the family. "I never saw her face, but her hands created true works of art." The Whitaker house, documented in rare photos from the county file, was a two-story structure with small windows and permanently closed curtains. The interior, according to descriptions, was surprisingly organized and clean, with mirrors notably absent. The walls of the living room displayed photographs of distant ancestors from generations prior to the severe deformities. Ruth, the youngest sister, kept a detailed diary, partially preserved in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society. In a 1965 entry, she wrote, "Today I observed my reflection in the well water. For a moment, with the light of the dusk, it almost seemed normal. I dreamed what it would be like to walk around the city without people shouting or children running away." The masks became more than simple coverings. They were alternative identities. Each sister had several masks for different occasions. Eleanor, the most skilled with a needle and thread, created masks with subtly different expressions, one with a slight smile for special days, another more neutral for everyday life. "The most extraordinary thing," wrote Dr. Liston, "is that even when they are alone at home, they rarely remove the masks. Margaret explained to me that they had become so accustomed to wearing them that they feel naked without them." The few visitors who entered the house, primarily Dr. Liston and occasionally the local pastor, reported that the sisters seemed to have developed an elaborate body language to compensate for their limited facial expressions. Hand gestures, head inclinations, and variations in posture communicated emotions that their covered faces could not express. Medical records show that in addition to facial deformities, the sisters suffered from secondary health problems. Eleanor had severe scoliosis, Margaret had progressive hearing loss, and Ruth suffered from chronic breathing problems, all characteristics consistent with syndromes associated with prolonged consanguinity. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Behind each mask, there is a soul that longs for dignity. The lives of these women remind us how acceptance and compassion are gifts that many have never known. The story of the Whitaker sisters, though extraordinary, is not unique. Research conducted by the Institute of Human Genetics at Johns Hopkins University between 1985 and 1997 identified at least 27 family centers in the Americas with similar patterns of genetic isolation and high rates of consanguineous marriages resulting in clusters of severe genetic conditions. In 1976, medical anthropologist Dr. Eduardo documented the case of the veiled women of Maher, in an isolated community in the mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. 5 women from the same extended family had facial deformities similar to the Whitaker sisters and adopted similar practices of concealment. Doctor noted, the masks have become part of their cultural identity, transforming a need into a tradition. In the Appalachia region, which extends across several Eastern American states, a study on the health of isolated communities conducted between 1970 and 1982 identified multiple cases of congenital malformations in communities with high rates of endogamy. The study, controversial at the time for its ethical and social implications, remained partially confidential until 2005. In the Melungeon community, an isolated triracial population of Appalachia, cases were documented in Hancock County, Tennessee. Rural Dr. William Kennedy registered in 1963, "I found 4 adult women using permanent veils, all from the same family lineage. Local residents respect their privacy, but outsiders often react with cruelty." In Nova Scotia, Canada, the small community of Fishers Harbour held the case of the MacDonald sisters, descendants of Scottish settlers who arrived in 1820 and remained extremely isolated. The 3 sisters, born in the 1940s, had severe facial deformities due to multiple generations of marriages between cousins. Parish records confirm 7 weddings between first-degree cousins in just 3 generations. The isolation of these communities was not only geographical but also informational. A review of medical records from the Appalachia region carried out by Dr. Harold Mitchell in 1988 revealed that basic information on the genetic risks associated with consanguineous marriages rarely reached these isolated communities. When it did arrive, it was often disregarded as external interference in established traditions. In an interview with the medical journal Frontiers in Genetics in 1990, a woman identified only as MS from an isolated community in Kentucky, who also used a mask to hide severe facial deformities, said, "No one told us that marrying cousins could cause problems. It was what everyone did. My parents were cousins. My grandparents were cousins. When my face started to develop differently, everyone thought it was just bad luck." A consistent pattern emerged from these various cases. Geographical isolation created the conditions for genetic isolation, often reinforced by religious or cultural beliefs that favored marriages within the same community or family. The subsequent social stigmatization deepened this isolation, creating a cycle that persisted for generations. Dr. Paul Bergman, a geneticist who studied multiple cases, observed in 1990, "The most disturbing aspect is not the genetic condition itself, but how the response to these conditions often worsened the suffering of the affected families." Public health records reveal that in many of these cases, basic medical interventions that could have softened some complications were either refused or never offered. The isolation, initially a cause of the conditions, also became an obstacle to treatment. Investigative journalist Michael Harkins, who tried to document some of these cases in 1988, wrote, "I found closed doors, unanswered calls, and occasionally veiled threats. These communities have learned through painful experience that exposure rarely brings benefits and often results in humiliation." Anthropologist Dr. Caroline Fisher, who has studied isolated communities for 3 decades, notes, "The use of masks, veils, or other methods of concealment became more than a practical response to physical deformities. In many cases, it evolved into a distinct cultural expression, almost an act of resistance against a world that rejected them." Time did not stand still in the Ozark Mountains. In 1987, Eleanor Whitaker passed away at 55 due to respiratory complications, a secondary condition related to her craniofacial malformations. Margaret followed in 1995 at the age of 61. Ruth, the youngest, lived until 2002, dying at 65. The family home, abandoned after the death of Ruth and their brother Thomas in 1998, remained for years as a silent monument to lives lived in the shadows. In 2008, a fire destroyed the structure, taking with it the last physical traces of that extraordinary family. However, the legacy of the Whitaker sisters and similar women in the Americas persists in unexpected forms. In 1992, the Craniofacial Anomalies Foundation was established, partially inspired by the cases documented by Dr. Liston. The foundation offers surgical treatment and psychological support for children and adults with severe facial malformations. Dr. Rachel Cohen, a plastic surgeon specializing in facial reconstruction, commented in 2010, "Cases like the Whitaker sisters show us the human cost of failures in our health systems and social support." Today, many of these conditions can be treated with relatively simple surgical interventions if identified early. Advances in genetic counseling and prenatal diagnostic techniques mean that many of the conditions that afflicted them can be prevented or treated. However, the social stigma associated with facial deformities persists, albeit in more subtle ways. The discovery in 1999 of some of the original Whitaker sisters' masks, preserved by a neighbor after Ruth's death, offered surprising insights. The masks, now part of the permanent collection of the University of Missouri, reveal extraordinary handicraft, made with multiple layers of fabric carefully sewn. Each mask has subtly defined facial characteristics, contours of cheeks, a suggestion of lips, even embroidered eyebrows. These are not simple utilitarian coverings, noted the museum curator, Dr. Elizabeth Chin. These are attempts to recreate the facial normality that genetics denied them. There is a moving dignity in this effort. In a rare interview given to Dr. Liston in 1980, Ruth Whitaker explained the meaning of the masks for her and her sisters. "People think we use them to hide, and this is partially true. But we also use them to reveal ourselves in the way we choose. When I make a mask, I decide who I will be that day. It is a power that my real face never gave me." Ruth's diary, which covers almost 4 decades of her life, offers moving glimpses of a reflective and deeply sensitive woman. In a 1972 entry, she wrote, "Some people think we live tragic lives, stuck in this house with these faces, but we know joy, too. When Eleanor plays the piano at dusk, when Margaret tells stories that make us laugh to tears, when Thomas returns from the city with a new book to read together. At these times, I forget about the masks completely." In isolated rural communities, practices of consanguineous marriage have decreased dramatically in recent decades due to greater mobility, access to education, and awareness of genetic risks. However, in some remote regions of the Americas, genetic isolation persists as a public health challenge. A study on marriage patterns in isolated communities, published in 2018 by the National Institutes of Health, documented an 87% reduction in marriages between first-degree cousins in U.S. rural areas since 1950. However, the same study identified pockets where endogamic practices persist, especially in communities with strong religious or cultural isolation. The stories of the women who lived behind masks remind us of the lasting power of social stigma and the extraordinary human capacity for resistance in the face of adversity. As Ruth Whitaker wrote in her diary in a 1997 entry, "Behind this mask, I have lived a complete life. Limited in some respects, yes, but rich in others. I have known love, beauty, and purpose. What else can anyone ask for?" If you have watched this far, it is because you appreciated this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really follows the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn more stories like this, stories that reveal forgotten aspects of our shared humanity. Leave your like to support this work of historical documentation and share it with someone who values understanding human experience in all its complexity.